Bam, 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 bam.
Okay, I'm Emma Redfoot, and I've been in Cusco for the past 6 months doing research on volunteer tourism and how volunteering could potentially help make the social organizations in Cusco more focused on sustainability.
And so you've been living in the Cusco area, and you've actually gone to the different organizations and connected with them to get more of an insider's perspective. Can you talk a little bit about what you discovered?
Yeah, okay. So my methodology was different from most volunteer tourism, because most people go and they stay at one project and they study volunteers, because it's kind of weird that there's this huge global movement of people going around the world, especially young people, but people of all ages really, going around the world and spending their vacation time and their money to go help someplace that isn't their home. So understanding that from a sociological perspective is what most of the research on volunteer tourism comes from. But actually knowing if they're doing good or not, if this movement is actually making a good impact, is something that's very much questioned in volunteer tourism. It's where most of the criticisms come from of volunteer tourism. So what I did was that I went and visited 17 different volunteer programs, and I tried to stay in Cusco, though I did go to some in Tambo, some in Pisac, and other places around Andoayasi, to see what the difference between rural and urban. But I did really want to focus more on urban and what it means to the volunteer tourism industry is doing in a town that's so based on tourism.
Okay.
Yeah.
But one of the things you just said was a place where volunteer tourism is actually, this is a center for volunteer tourism.
Yeah.
So you're talking about Cusco and the Sacred Valley attracting, how many people would you say come to volunteer and partake in the tourism?
It's something that's really hard for me to give a good number there. There's 2 million tourists that come through Cusco every year, but most of them come on a very short basis. Most of them are coming for under 14 days, and they're coming to see the Sacred Valley, Machu Picchu, and be gone. In terms of my survey that I've done, which I think I'm up to 140 people at this point, which isn't a large enough group to say anything. And I did focus in areas where there are more volunteers to ask for people to help, but most of them were volunteers, so 50%. But I would say that in terms of just like sheer numbers, if I had to put a number on it, at least 60,000 people come through Cusco and the Sacred Valley to volunteer a year.
That's an incredible number.
Yeah.
And why do you think Cusco and the Sacred Valley has become like a popular spot to come for volunteer tourism?
Well, the thing about volunteer tourism is that one thing that's interesting is that volunteers that come to these places often don't volunteer in their home countries. So it's very different motivations than just volunteers, than like people who volunteer in the home area. I think it's a lot of the draw. It comes from the same reasons that people come here as tourists. It's because you can see Machu Picchu. It's because Peru is viewed also as a poor country still, and as a place that you can help more. In terms of my survey, people thought generally that they could make a bigger difference in Cusco than they could in their home countries. And so it's something where they're partially drawn to the idea of like, hey, I can maybe make a bigger difference here, bring my skill set here, because it's poor and not set up systematically. And then it's also a bunch of young people, and so maybe like the systems in the US where you have such a bureaucracy, or systems in Western Europe would demand that you have a certain education level or have so many years of experience before you could do something, where here you would need that quite as much. So I think that people are attracted to Cusco because it's got this mysticism partially that's so attractive. It's safe is another one that people don't want to admit how much the risk, how how much the risk makes them not attracted to other areas as much as it is to Cusco. But if the way that I asked my survey questions, you could see that like avoiding risk was something that was attractive about Cusco to people, as well as like having a hot shower. So it's a balance of both a place that's in need as well as a place that can supply comforts to them, both like physical comforts as well as, you know, the foods they want to eat. There's Indian restaurants here.
You're talking about the volunteers that come, so their needs have to be met, as well as feeling as if they're doing something of service.
Yes, I mean that's the sign. Like for volunteers, what makes them feel the most successful is if they felt like they made a difference.
Okay.
And Anyway, what were you gonna say?
Well, I'm wondering, how many people did you survey that were volunteering? You said it was 130?
140. I need to look at it right now, but
the majority of the people that were volunteers, that were here for the volunteer tourism in the Sacred Valley in Cusco, what countries were they from?
Most of them are from the United States and England. Especially in Cusco, 50% of tourists that come through Cusco are from the United States. So it's going to be a huge percentage, you know, on that side. I still haven't tallied that up completely. I was actually really surprised it was less Americans and less British people than I expected. I thought it would be like a lot more, because internationally those are the countries that have the most volunteers coming out of them, international volunteers. And with such a large population being from the U.S., because right now Mexico is dangerous, or at least people perceive it as being dangerous, and Peru is definitely has a lot of draw, mysticism, and it's cheaper to fly into. It's not Bolivia where you have to pay an extra visa cost.
Right.
So definitely they've seen a growth coming from the U.S., but it's definitely people from all over the place. I've been amazed by how many Brazilians I've met, just anecdotally. I've met Eastern Europeans, I've met Canadians. They seem to be everywhere.
We met quite a few of them too. Some questions for you regarding there's two parts of volunteering. Well, actually, to me it seems like there's three parts of what you're talking about. There's the volunteer and what they're getting out of it. There's the organization that has arranged the entire, you know, volunteer tourist quote unquote package.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the community that's being served. Can you talk about those three different aspects and maybe how their needs come together or not come together?
Well, if you link to my website, I actually have this thing called a concept map that does show how those different organizations link in. And I mean, this is definitely, like, the volunteer tourism industry is a very bureaucratic one. So it's something where it's like you have these big organizations like Global Crossroads or Projects Abroad or Helping Hands that cost $2,000 to $5,000 that are the ones that get out there and advertise and have people advertising for these opportunities in all different kinds of places. And that's one route that people can go through. Not a ton of people. I mean, it's so expensive that if you research a little bit more, you can find cheaper ways of doing it. The other way in Cusco, that's probably the most concentrated way of getting word out about volunteer opportunities. The packagers are the language schools in Cusco, and so the language schools in Cusco are the ones that different projects come to and ask, like, hey, can you send us volunteers? And then the language schools ask for a little bit of money, and they're supposed to be have a volunteer coordinator who then works with the volunteer and make sure that they're prepared and works with the local project to make sure they know what they need to do, as well as hopefully giving resources to this project. And I mean, the good ones give resources in the forms of asking for a list and giving blankets and giving whatever the list says instead of directly giving money. And then the third way is people can just contact directly the local projects, and depending on how well they're run, they do have a website or they have some way of being out there. Volunteer tourism doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pay for your volunteer opportunity, but it's pretty popular here, and I don't necessarily disagree with paying as long as the project is transparent.
Okay.
About where the money is going, making sure it's going to the right places, letting making sure that the volunteers actually have a support structure instead of them just showing up and being like, oh, we don't really know what to do with you, please give us your money. So,
and does that happen?
I mean, if in Cusco, what I've run into a lot is a lot of people with a lot of good intentions who have set up different projects, who have some sort of funder coming from the US or coming from Australia or coming from Western Europe, and they want to do good and they want to take on volunteers, but they just don't know what they need to do. So like they're local Cuscanians that maybe starting an after school project, and they don't know that the volunteers need, when they show up, to be sat down and say, like, what are our objectives? And then a week later say, okay, have you met these goals, and how are you feeling personally as a person? Like, do you feel like you're becoming a part of this community? Are you feeling like your project is growing? Do you need resources? They think that people are just going to show up and be able to help out. But the thing about volunteer tourism is that it's almost always a positive experience for the volunteer, but it can be traumatic at first.
In what way?
It's something where it's the same way as in any kind of culture. It's like you're dropped into a different culture, and the thing about volunteer tourism, what usually motivates people to do it, is having a deeper connection with the culture. This is a way to actually get to know a real culture instead of just seeing the sights, particularly. And so, and getting to know local people. At least that's the idea that they come at it from.
And is that idea sometimes changes, it shift during the experience?
Well, what I have to say about Cusco that's interesting is that, my survey shows that like most people volunteer for 3 or 4 hours a day. Okay. My notion of volunteer tourism was so totally different before I came here, because I lived on a farm in a community.
Right.
And that was,
that was 24 hours a day.
It was 24 hours a day, it was something, and I knew everybody, and I had to speak Spanish, and here it's something where it's like people can go, maybe, and they usually, I think, do sign up to volunteer because they want to really have an authentic experience, but once they get here and they see there's so many international people and there's so much fun they can have, then it becomes something where it's like they go do their 3 to 4 hour work, but they're really more engaging in the traveler culture more than anything.
Interesting.
And they start taking things less responsible, which is a problem that comes up in every conversation I have with the organizations, is that, people stop taking things responsibly because of distractions around Cusco. And volunteering, I was hoping to discuss as one of the few options for the international community and the local community to really blend. But it doesn't seem to really be that way, because volunteers go and they go to people's places of work, and they only see them in their work setting. They don't see their personal lives. They don't, connect with them as people. They connect with them as workers. And then they return to their own culture. So it's something where it's so hard to find shared space in Cusco, and even in this way.
To blend the cultures. So you've brought up that there's a couple of issues. Number one, sometimes the experience with volunteers is when they arrive at an organization, there's not a real set task list for them to do, and there's no checks and balances to find out if it's a successful interaction, right? The second thing you said was there's not a real merging of cultures, and it's not the real inner exchange that people wanted from the beginning. And then the last thing you said is that somehow volunteers get disillusioned and get more caught up with the tourist or the party or all of that. But now, this is all from the volunteer's perspective. Yeah. Can you talk about any of the problems from the local perspective?
There's one other thing that just from the volunteer's perspective that I think is one of the most important parts, and what I am advocating for quite a bit is that volunteers also don't know what to look for before they join a volunteer or project. They don't know what to expect. They don't know what to look for. They always want more information before they come to a place. But it's also something where they could be supporting a project that either just is run by a foreigner and ends 6 months later, or a project where there are some projects in Cusco where they purposefully don't progress the project because they want it to look dirty so that they get more money.
So there's more funding.
More funding because they look more in need.
And it's a business.
And it's a business. And volunteer tourism is a business, definitely.
It is.
When it comes up to those organizations that are charging $2,000 or $3,000 a month, it definitely is.
Wow.
And so it's something where making sure that, like, part of what I'm hoping to do is send out more information to travel guides, to different, like, Lonely Planet, to try to get the word out there of, like, these are the questions you should ask before you start a volunteer project.
So, like, an advocate for the volunteers that are partaking in the volunteer tourism.
For the volunteer to be a good consumer, because that's something that's going to help both sides. It's going to help the volunteer be able to ask questions like, first ask yourself, like, do I need a hot shower? How many hours a day do I want to work? What kind of comfort level do I need? What kind of support structure do I need? Do I have an idea for a project? Does that project need resources? Like, ask yourself those questions, and then make sure that the organization seems to be put together and has a way of demonstrating that they've grown, that they've had, like, results that have been positive over the years, that they have a plan for the future, that they have plans of growth for the future, that they're not just thinking, like, I'm going to do this forever. So it can be something where it also supports the better organizations that are actually making better impacts.
Right.
If the volunteers go to these good places. From the local perspective, Cusco is a very interesting place because it's the oldest inhabited city in South America.
It is.
Yeah. But it's tripled in growth it's tripled in population in the last 20 years. So it's actually quite a young city in that respect. And so one thing that you don't want volunteer organizations to do is to just give things away, because here, like, the foreigners are so looked at as sources of money more than anything. And so you don't want social organizations to reinforce that kind of, like, dependency mindset that, I mean, people are creative here and they're very capable, but there's just not a belief that they can do things so much. And so at least that's, like, what I've seen, just anecdotally, just from my own perspective. Like, people don't start businesses, local people don't start businesses here. Like, how many of the people that you've met are foreigners that run businesses, or even the venues?
There's quite a few.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the social organizations definitely need to work on making sure to reinforce, like,
empowerment,
definitely. Mm-hmm. Which I have found that, like, in terms of their websites, at least, they definitely do. But from the local organizations do have problems with the volunteers. Everything from them not being responsible to, in truth, volunteers come thinking they're going to help change the world, but often they actually cost more than they give. It's like you have to train them. You have to have them feel comfortable working in a culture that's not their own. And language, which so it's, I mean, some organizations have you pay for a translator if you don't speak Spanish, and so it's something where it's like, you know, it takes so much time out of the organizer's life
that they're not doing
their
service
or whatever the volunteer's doing they could do faster. And
makes sense.
And as well as, like, being that management. So it's like, okay, thinking about a project for this person and thinking about a timeline for this person and checking in with them to make sure that they're having a positive, productive experience. So that's one issue. And you know, for me, what I'm also advocating for is to start. I want to start my own organization that works with different REDs, or, like, social networking groups in Cusco. that work with a bunch of the different social projects in Cusco, and providing some things like being the consultant and sending volunteers to the projects that work best for them, and then checking in with the volunteers and taking some of those overheads away from the projects.
Right.
But in return, demanding that the projects be transparent.
Right.
That they should have some way of demonstrating results, and using volunteers as a source of going out there and doing that kind of research to see where results are happening, and then you can share information. You have that kind of collective system.
Right.
But
that sounds like a really positive project.
Yeah. I'm planning on applying for a Fulbright. And,
awesome.
and trying to do that. So, because the social network's already here with their contacts, but they don't actually ask for anything that would mean positive results for any social organization.
Can you talk about the communities that have the most need here? Has somebody come in and done a general need assessment? And can you identify which communities are most in need? And then which are the most attractive for volunteers to work with? Because I would imagine that there's not
mix there.
Yeah.
Well, I've read one study that I thought was really interesting. The group that most people want to work with is with kids, definitely,
yes.
And it's working with young kids. And there's a group called Red Semilla Nueva out there that it works kind of to give suggestions, like if a new group's starting, like if you want to start a kids group, these are the ages that actually need support right now. These are the areas that actually need support right now. But the study that I read was discussing, because I did try to focus in Cusco, single mothers. Single mothers are absolutely the
group that needs the most support, because if you
and
look
I'm
at,
passionate about this group.
yeah, because I mean 24% of Cusco is impoverished, and over 75% of that is single mothers.
Wow.
And there's no social structures for support.
Well, the study that I read was actually about what are their social networks like, and like just they had these different mothers draw circles to show like how far their network spreads. So the first circle was like somebody that you see every day, so like your boss or a man in your life or whatever. And then the second circle was like acquaintances that you might see. And then third circle was like people that you see occasionally, like relatives that might be out of the city. And all these women had the first circle, and that was it. They had like one person that they saw every day, and that was all of their support structure.
Wow.
And so it's something where, and beyond that, like these women are usually working 7 days a week, and they have to pay rent by the month. And if they don't go to work one day, they don't get paid that day.
Right, of course.
And so if they're sick or go home drunk or something, then they don't get paid that day, and then they move. And so these women are moving over 2 times a year at least. And so it's really hard for them to, on average it was like, I don't remember the exact thing, but it was like 2 point something. And so they're moving, and so that their kid can really be, like stay at one after school program or even one school program. They don't make friends. Like the notion of them going out and having coffee with somebody is beyond their potential life.
And they're probably part of the new population that has come into the city as well, because if they don't have a family structure here, then that means that, you know, they're really disconnected from their culture.
Yeah, and it's something where sometimes, like pregnant women, if they're being an economic burden, their families won't really welcome them to stay.
And they'll leave their small communities to come to a city because they believe that there's work here, which is an opportunity.
And then a lot of single mothers also comes from rape, and so
is that a big problem here?
Oh yeah, huge problem.
I haven't heard about this. Tell me what you've found.
Well, I mean, one of the organizations that I really like and support is called Casa de Untied, and it's a house for young women who have been raped and been pregnant from that. And one thing about Peru that's absolutely stunning is that like for women over the age of 18, or 18 or over, it's not called rape, it's called seduction.
You're kidding.
And the women pretty much don't think of it as rape so much unless they get pregnant from it. And
this is really a women's rights issue.
Oh yeah.
But it's a cultural way of thinking that
and
needs to be shifted.
Oh yeah, clearly, and definitely from the women's perspective as well. Because like my mother was raped, the guy was raped. It's just what happens. And it used to be until 2006, it was 14 and over was considered seduction.
Wow.
So that just changed recently, and now, and like even when it's 14 and over, the men aren't immediately incarcerated if they're accused. They run away. If they're 14 and younger, then the father's immediately incarcerated. But and so it's so that's something where like a large portion of those women that are coming have been a victim of rape. It's something where also like familial rape is a big deal. So in this Casa de Untied volunteer program, they have room for like 18 women, and they've got a waiting list. It's just huge for them to stay until they're 18. And and they've all been, and the woman that I talked to who runs this program said that most of them were raped by family members.
Their family members. Oh boy.
And so
interesting. I mean, without getting into like this, like really deep into the social problems, because that's something that could be explored. But I really want to focus on
one thing that I think is really interesting about that, and in terms of bringing it back to volunteer tourism, is that one reason why there's such a huge growth of NGOs and nonprofits of different sorts in Cusco, which there's been a huge growth of that. And like I've got a graph that shows, and that's true globally, and so it's partially that. But I think there's just a demand for it here. The government clearly isn't covering everything that needs to happen. Like in the case of Casa de Untied, they work with the government because the government sends them people, but the government doesn't support those women. This is an organization that's supported by Spain. Like that's where they get their money from. And so, partially, I think that the growth of different organizations, social projects in Cusco, is based on the fact that people come here and they see that there is a need for better education for kids, more opportunities for kids to be kids and not just go home after school and like have to help work. And so, like, most of the projects around Cusco are for kids, because that's where people are most attracted to helping. Though I think, there are several like houses for men that suffer from alcoholism, and I think that if they could change that would make a huge difference. But in Cusco, it's so hard because there's not a lot of things for families to do together, and so much of the social interaction is surrounding alcohol, and so even just providing like something that families can do together is something that the one thing I think is really interesting is that these volunteer programs aren't just working with communities, and that's a language that we use a lot, like projects working with communities. They're creating communities because these people don't have a lot of a strong social structure, support system. And so it's something where it's like, they're not in Cusco. A lot of the neighborhoods know each other, but a lot of them don't really have like a sense of community, a sense of somebody who would take care of your kid if you couldn't right then, and so they're actually creating these support structures.
Are a good majority of the volunteer organizations, are they affiliated with some religion, or are they created by good intention foreigners, or what do you find is the majority of the organizations? Where were they born?
I would say that you have a little bit over 50%, I think, that are run by foreigners.
That's a huge that surprises me. So good intention foreigners that have come here and fallen in love with the community, the town, and want to do something.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say a lot over. I mean, if you talk to most people who run projects, they'll be like, it's mostly run by foreigners. But what I ran into, in terms of just writing a bunch of different organizations, and the smaller ones are run by local people. And there is definitely some religiously affiliated organizations. Clearly, when I first came, I was thinking about doing the difference between secular and religious organizations. I ended up not pursuing that because I wanted to do something more practical. But they do a lot of the same stuff. There is a big difference there, I think, between secular and religious volunteering. But they do a lot of the same work. They demand that the local people be a part of their church system in order to get these services. But honestly, in terms of like the volunteer perspective, what's interesting, I think, about religious organizations is that they still aren't really focused on proselytizing in Cusco. What a lot of the point of these religious volunteer organizations is for the volunteer who's coming from the first world countries to feel more of a connection with their religion, so that from there on they're actually more devoted and more willing to give money, and they're more connected because a volunteer experience is such a transformational experience.
Okay, now, but you bring up something really interesting. You're talking about the perception of a volunteer from a first, quote-unquote, first world country. And if they're coming with a background of religion or any separation between who they are and the community that they're serving, it creates a barrier, right, between the people that are being served. And I think when you talk about people coming with good intentions, okay, they come with good intentions, but there's also that feeling that, well, I know more than you because I'm from first world. And that spills over into education, and that's where I put up my arms and say, okay, let's look at this, and let's look at what the perception is. What have you come across in that?
One thing is that, a lot of people come with this notion of like, I'm going to come help Peru, like I'm going to come change things, I've got these skills, I've got these first world skills, and then they get here and they realize that they don't know anything, and they actually leave without that perspective. Like
this is positive.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not saying this for 100% of anybody, but
right.
I'm saying that a lot, like what I've seen and what I've seen talking to people is that, one of their main motivations when they get here is to make a difference. But when they leave, it's more like to get to know the culture, because they recognize that, like, in a month, as an 18-year-old kid, like, you're gonna learn a lot more. You're gonna gain a lot more always from these experiences than you possibly give. Yeah, and so that's definitely a positive thing. And people do come with this, like, and part of the attractiveness of volunteering to some people is that you're going to be given more responsibilities in Peru, maybe, than you would be in Canada, in terms of, like, oh, you teach a class, you teach English now. It's like, well, I'm 19, I haven't graduated, okay, cool. Like, that's something where in this setting you're going to be given a little bit more of those responsibilities, where you can be like, I have these skills. And so that's part of the attractive quality, but it's also something where you don't want people to come in and think that, they're better than anybody.
And do you think that happens?
I think that it does happen, and I've run into people that, talking to volunteers, that's just a painful experience where they're like, I just wanted to see a poorer community. It's like, I wanted to see a poorer community where I could do more. And it's just like, why? And it's just like, they don't learn that, like, what this is an exchange. Like, what volunteering is at its core. And definitely the volunteers gain more than the local people.
Oh, okay. Say that again. Definitely?
The volunteers gain more than the local people from the interaction.
Well, that's something to consider and something to really think about.
Because, I mean, unless you're staying for a really long time, usually you cost more than you give. And then for the volunteers, in terms of what studies show, is that volunteers, after the volunteer experience, go home calmer. So they're just like more, they're more, they're less stressed out.
So it's a transformational change for the volunteers. What would you say was the most surprising discovery that changed your perception about the whole volunteer tourism process?
I would have to say, actually, the thing that probably was the moment that like surprised me the most was when I realized that these different organizations weren't working with communities. Like, that was probably what, just because, I mean, I could do as much reading as I wanted, but they used the term like community and working with this community, and what I found in Cusco was that people were working with individual families, were working with individual kids, where they came to an after school program, but it wasn't something where like this community decided they wanted this thing.
Right.
It's not something where you could sit down and have a community connected conversation separately from the organization, because the organization was the one that brought these people together. Like,
they were in a community before.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go outside of Cusco, it is like Sacred Valley and Oyasi. Like, these are the organizations that, you know, they're the ones that like do artisania, that have volunteers come out and help with that, or help them promote like their textiles or something like that. That's a community. But in Cusco itself, people are working with making these communities. And so, because so much of it, of the literature, and same with ecotourism, is like benefiting the community, making sure that the community makes a decision to invite you.
But the community doesn't exist.
And so that was probably one of the most surprising things.
So there's a disconnect.
Yeah, well, and yeah, it's just something that shows a certain quality of Cusco as a town that has just grown so much in population, that there isn't this like long-term communities that exist. I mean, they do exist clearly, but they're not the poor ones that that are needing the most help. So,
what would you say your opinion about volunteer tourism? Is it beneficial? Does it work here in Cusco? What's your opinion about it?
I personally think generally I like volunteer tourism because it shows a couple things about the world we live in as a whole. The fact that people do want to give their time and their vacation to getting to know a local culture, and working, putting their own like work into it also. I think that shows a really positive postmodern aspect of the world that we live in. And so from that volunteers' perspective, I would say that, and it's like a positive thing for them, that's a really like good signifier for for the world that I'm living in. So I enjoyed that part of it. In terms of actually like doing good, I can't say yet. And so I think that there are organizations that, and clearly every organization that I talk to has made a difference in some people's lives for the better. It's definitely made a difference for the kids. The kids, by meeting volunteers, have a bigger perspective of the world, at least. You know, have a bigger perspective of what they can do. Like, and so it's like this role model that can change things.
Well, that's a positive.
Definitely, it's a huge positive. And so, I mean, the negatives that can come from volunteer tourism are that organizations focus on projects for the volunteer more than actually serving the local community, and sometimes they use volunteers instead of hiring workers, and so
so that affects the economy.
So it can be something where, you know, like those are two major negatives that people say about volunteer tourism. But I think that in general, you know, it's helping people little by little. I think that if we could start more conversations going within the different organizations, that it could do a lot better. It could be a lot more efficient, because everybody's reinventing the wheel right now. Every organization comes up with like, I want to help, but they're like inventing a survey to ask people what they want. They're inventing their own way of communicating with people. They're having to figure out what is their relationship with the government, what is their tax code? What are the hours that work for people? Like, it's something where, I mean, I think that it could be run a lot better, and if people would work together, which they should, they're all trying to do good in the world, then it could be a lot better. But
so, can you tell us what's next for Emma Redfoot?
What's next for Emma Redfoot? Well, I've been here for 6 months, almost to the day, and I'm going back to see my mama and my papa and my grandparents and my cousins, my uncle and my brother, and going back to Washington, D.C. for Christmas, and then go back to Lewis and Clark, Portland, Oregon, where they were the ones that supported me through this, and writing up my thesis and hopefully getting it out there. And then my plan is to try to apply for a grant so that I can come back here and actually put into action what my thesis is about and see if it works in an urban setting like Cusco, maybe if it could work in other places as well.
And I saw you give a talk about your study results. Is there a place online where people can look at your presentation and look at what your results are and your...
Well, project? It's going to be up there soon.
Okay, so we'll link to it, though. We'll provide links when it's ready.
Yeah, because I would like to leave my survey open for a little bit longer to get as many people as possible. And then beyond that, I mean, I still haven't transcribed all of my interviews by anywhere close to.
Right.
But
you still have some work to do.
So I have some work to do, but this isn't necessarily needing to be totally done until May. But I have up there right now different ideas that I've had throughout this. So different, like, what does corruption mean in the volunteer tourism industry? Who are volunteers? What does sustainability mean? Right. Those kind of questions I've worked through in shorter papers that are up on my website right now.
Okay, good. We'll link to that. And if you could leave us with one piece of advice for somebody who's considering volunteer tourism here in Cusco, what would that be?
Well, I would say make sure to Skype with them before you get here. Okay. I mean, that's a short one, but it's something where it's like you'll see them face to face. You can pick up on actually how seriously they're taking things on. You can ask them all of the questions that you want to ask and make sure that they have the answers that work for you. As well as, when you're asking those questions, think both about, okay, what do I need as a volunteer? And what do I want to do? And then also, is this community actually interacting with, or is this organization actually interacting with and helping with the people in Cusco in a way that I support? Okay. So in a way that they're empowered, they're not just giving things, in a way where they demonstrate results in some respects, in a way where you don't feel like they're just trying to take money from you. So yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for tea, and thank you for asking me. It's something that I love talking about.
Yeah, I could see how passionate you are about what you're working on. Yeah, it's
cool.
Great.
Yeah,
it's great. Okay,
yeah.
give me a hug.
Yeah.
Thank you, sweetie.
Thank you so much.